More times than not, when people are accused of murder, they deny. But according to police, that wasn't what happened in this case. I'm Elizabeth Millner for Law&Crime. Before we get into this case, I want to tell you about something exciting at Law&Crime. We're launching a new channel called Scandal that is dedicated to exposing the dark side of fame, covering all the wild crimes in Hollywood and diving into the disturbing rumors floating around celebrity circles. To stay up to date on all the latest celebrity scandals, click the link in the description of this video and subscribe to Scandal today. All right, back to the story. So in this case, a Texas dad told police he wanted to go to jail after his wife's body was discovered wrapped in a tarp inside the couple's home. And just this week, he's learning his fate. This case began with a call to police. It happened last year on April 19th when they were dispatched to a home in Fort Worth, Texas. It was there officers found a woman wrapped inside a blue tarp in one of the bedrooms. Officers noted there was blood on her skin and bruising near her neck. There was sadly no chance of saving her. Police pronounced her dead on the scene. The victim, Kristlynne Robertson, a mom of 5. When officers spoke with her brother-in-law, he said he had been away for several days, and when he returned home, he saw his brother Christopher, who was also Kristlynne's husband, and he was allegedly extremely drunk inside the home. Christopher's brother's name was redacted from the arrest affidavit, but he told police his brother walked into his bedroom, and that's when he smelled a strong, foul odor. He saw his brother trip over something in the bedroom, and that's when he noticed he didn't just trip over something random, it was Kristlynne's body in a tarp. Christopher's brother then called police. When officers spoke with Christopher himself, according to the arrest affidavit, he was too drunk to understand what the officer was saying. The next day, a judge signed off on a search warrant for the home. When the medical examiner pulled the tarp off Kristlynne, she had blood on the front of her chest, but she had to be transferred to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy. After taking a closer look, officials learned more. She had been shot in the lower left side of her face, and bullet fragments were still lodged into her head. The medical examiner confirmed she was shot once in the face, right below her left eye. After receiving that news, Fort Worth PD got another 911 call, this time from Christopher. He told the call taker, "My father-in-law is going to kill me. I actually killed his daughter. I killed his daughter." So officers responded again to the Robertson home, where Christopher admitted to police he shot his wife and wanted to go to jail. According to his arrest affidavit, he even handed over the gun he used to shoot his wife. Officials say Christopher shot and killed her a week before her body was discovered, meaning Kristlynne was left dead inside the home for several days before her brother-in-law discovered her. Christopher was ultimately arrested and charged with his wife's murder, and his bond was set at $100,000. But he never bonded out. Instead, he stayed in the Tarrant County Jail until trial. Just last week, a Tarrant County jury found Christopher Robertson guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. It's unclear if he appeared remorseful when he got his conviction or even his sentence. But prosecutors made one thing clear: Christopher's actions resulted in 5 children now being left to grow up without their mother. 50 years is a lengthy sentence. Let's break this down with criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Safa, always great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me. A Texas husband is convicted for his wife's murder, but what's your reaction to this case?
It's not surprising, the lengthy sentence here. You know, this is a gruesome murder. This allegedly took place in the family home. We don't know if the 5 children were there at the time, but this woman leaves behind 5 children. Ultimately, the allegations and was found at trial was that this defendant ultimately shot his wife, wrapped her in a tarp, and left her body there for a number of days. So very gruesome. It's certainly not surprising that he was ultimately sentenced to 50 years in prison, considering the facts and circumstances. And not only that, most importantly, there were 5 children that were left behind. And so I think that this sentence of 50 years is not surprising and certainly justified.
A big thank you to Odoo for sponsoring us. Odoo is an incredible all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications. One of my personal favorites is Odoo's website builder. With their drag and drop features and AI copywriter, it helps me come up with website descriptions like the site I built for my cat Buttons. It was pretty easy to set up, and just a couple minutes later, I now have buttonsthecat.com. So again, a huge thank you to Odoo for sponsoring our news stories. You can build your website now as well. The domain is free for the first year when you use our link, odoo.com/lcnewsweb. Again, that's odoo.com/lcnewsweb for a free domain for your first year. And just going back to April of last year when the offense actually occurred, it seems like the key witness in a way was Christopher's own brother. He noticed the foul smell, he locked the gun away from Christopher after seeing the body, and he called police. What do you make of his brother turning in his own brother in a way?
Ultimately, it seems that the brother, did the right thing. He came home. He ultimately noticed that some things were odd or out of place, found or seemed to be able to locate the wife's body in the bedroom after the husband had gone into the bedroom, and knew that just something wasn't right and something wasn't off. Ultimately, the wife was murdered in this case. Could it have expanded to the children? We don't know, or anybody else. So it appears that the brother knew that something was off, took the appropriate precautions by safeguarding a firearm that he knew was on the marital home property, and ultimately, reported his brother to police.
And prosecutors say that Kristlynne's body was left in that tarp for about a week or so. In your opinion, what was the point of wrapping her in a tarp just to leave her inside the home, where it just feels like he was essentially just kind of leaving her there just to, in a way, decompose?
We don't know what the motivation was behind this act, but what is a possibility, and of course we can't speculate and think into the mind of the defendant here, but it could be possible that he thought that he was going to conceal her there for a certain amount of time. He maybe thought that the tarp was going to conceal the odor of the body while he figured out what he was going to do with her, or how he was ultimately going to dispose of her. So that is certainly possible. We also know that this individual, at least when the brother returned home, was heavily intoxicated. And so that could be a factor into what occurred, how he ultimately decided to somewhat dispose of the body, and other decisions that he made with respect to this.
And just going off him being intoxicated when police responded to the home, do you think it was because he was remorseful for what he had done, or do you think it's because he knew he'd be going to jail? Why do you think that he was just at that kind of insane level of intoxication where police even noted it in their arrest affidavit?
This case altogether is very odd, and there is a question of, what would cause somebody to do something like this, especially to the wife, especially to the mother of their children, when they have 5 children, or much less anybody. But in this particular case, it raises a significant question as to the motive of why this occurred. Not only that, but is there drug or alcohol abuse that was occurring, with respect to the relationship in the family home? If the individual knew that ultimately he was going to get caught for murdering his wife, he could have just been on a downward spiral, drinking and things of that nature to self-soothe, ultimately until he was arrested by police. I know that there was also a 911 call that was placed by the defendant, in which he indicated to the 911 operator that he was afraid that his wife's father was going to kill him because he killed his wife, or he killed his daughter. So there could have been a number of things that caused this individual to spiral, and alcohol certainly appeared to be a contributing factor at some point during this investigation.
And, as a criminal defense attorney, what are the challenges of defending a client who already admitted to police that he did the crime, and even in this case that he wanted to go to jail?
There are certainly challenges with a case like this, but one of the things that people often don't know or realize is that, and it depends on the facts as they roll in. With cases like this, especially when an individual has made a statement to law enforcement, we always challenge those statements. So one of the things that you've often heard, probably many a times, is you're under arrest, you have a right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you, your Miranda rights. There's a point in time where those Miranda rights get triggered, and that's when the police are investigating something or a crime at hand. However, pre-investigation, there's a short time period where an individual may be answering questions, and those questions and their responses can be what the law deems gratuitous in nature. But once we get to the point where the person is detained in custody for the purposes of the investigation, that triggers Miranda. So in a case like this, a defense attorney might raise an issue and say, Judge, at the point in time when my client made this statement, he was under arrest, he wasn't free to leave. These statements were not gratuitous in nature. It triggered the Miranda warnings to be read, and ultimately that didn't happen in this case. And so his statements about murdering his wife should be suppressed or thrown out as a result of that. Now, I don't know if that was a specific fact in this case, but those are the ways that we challenge statements coming in.
And that would make a lot of sense too, because, when you're making a 911 call and no one on the other line is, reading your Miranda rights. So I can understand why a defense attorney would want that suppressed and not shown to a jury during trial. But, going kind of back to the motive here, I know there have been some reports that Kristlynne's family actually wanted her to leave her husband and that he's actually been abusive to her before. Do you think that that kind of may have played into the motive here a little bit? Because also just going back to the murder itself, shooting your wife in the face to the point where she had been shot like right under her left eye, that just seems very personal, and it just seems like it was done for a reason. It didn't seem like this would be an accident per se or anything like that. But what do you just make of just the potential motive that it might have been her being abused before?
It would not surprise me at all if this relationship had a history of domestic violence. When things like this happen, especially as brutal and as gruesome as this case is, oftentimes there has been a prior pattern of abuse. So I highly doubt that this was the first act of violence that this individual committed against his wife. And ultimately, we know that other family members had concerns, wanted her to leave him for the sake of her safety and the safety of her children. And so it's not surprising here. With domestic violence cases, they can be very difficult because there is a cycle or a pattern of abuse. Not only that, but if they're married, is she going to be able to take care of herself if she ultimately leaves the relationship? What happens to the children? So there's so many things that factor in. But with respect to this case, it's not surprising to learn that there is a history of violence here, considering it was a clean shot to the face. So this is something that is, very thought out, very personal, and very gruesome, and it shows a sort of rage and anger on behalf of the defendant to have committed something like this.
Just horrible overall. Given that the defendant in this case, given that Kristlynne Robertson, had made those statements to police on the 911 call, are you surprised that the case even went to trial as opposed to just taking a plea?
No, absolutely not. And kind of to your point earlier, so when an individual makes statements on a 911 call, that's treated differently than when an individual makes statements to law enforcement officers. When an individual makes a statement, or calls 911 and says, hey, I did X, Y, and Z, those statements are often good statements is what we call them. They will ultimately play into trial. So those won't be suppressed because the dispatcher is not considered law enforcement for these purposes. But what would be required is that dispatcher to come in and testify as to the contents of the call. They would likely play the call at trial, which the jury essentially would hear. Not surprised this case went to trial. Considering the allegations, and the allegations here were murder, this individual was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And if I'm not mistaken, Texas is a death penalty state, so he was certainly subject to the death penalty. And so by going to trial, he really didn't have anything to lose. I highly expect that the prosecution in this case wanted a plea to murder and possibly a significant amount of time in prison, or they made no offer and said, nope, he can plead guilty to everything or go to trial. And ultimately he decided to go to trial because he didn't really have anything to lose. I don't know if at some point he's going to be placed on death row or be subject to the death penalty. I think they've gotten past that and he's just going to be doing the 50 years. So in a case like this, it may just be a matter of saving the person's life by ensuring that they spend the rest of their life in jail, but that they're not subject to the death penalty.
Because either way, 50 years is still a long amount of time to be in prison. And like to your point, that may essentially equal a life sentence, possibly in this case. Safa Robinson-Ferrer, thank you so much for your insight into this case. I always appreciate your time. Before we sign you off, do you think justice was served here?
Absolutely.
Online records show Kristlynne Robertson is still in the Tarrant County Jail until he transfers into prison. Again, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison, meaning he won't be getting out until he's 85 years old. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.